What else do we need to know about type? Installing, you can just double click a font, exporting, warping type, doing all kinds of cool things like that. Or even things like bold and italics. And you're like, bold and italics, that's pretty basic. You click the bold tab, you click the italics tab, right? No. Let me call up this thing here, and let's talk about bold and italic. Here's a font called Times New Roman. And I've got some examples here of italics, bold, and now I have called it what it is. It is fake italic. If you go under your character panel, they're going to be all fancy about it, and they'll be like, it's faux, F-A-U-X. What does faux mean? Yeah, it's French. It means fake. So it's fake italic. You don't want to be using those. Look at this. For the regular font, say the A has that fancy little bowl on the front there. On the italics version, it's got a circle with a little curly Q on the end. The M has like a little fancy thing and a little, it's nicer. Whoever created this font had to create a separate glyph for every single character in an italics form. It's not just the fake italics, which basically just kind of, let's throw on some fake italics. You ready for this? This is horrifying. It just says, well, let's take all that vector information, let's just skew it over. Like, there's nothing, there's no pizzazz to that. So there's your fake italics down there. It's the same A, it's the same E. It's just nasty. Look at how fancy that E is in italics. That's your fake italics. And it's the same thing with the bold. Here's your regular bold, the actual bold. And look at how thin the line here. It gets quite wide down here to give it that bold look, but it's still nice and thin and graceful. The serifs are thin and graceful. The fake bold, it just takes the original letters and it just kind of bulbs it out. It says, well, let's take all that vector information and let's just blah. It's not classy at all. It's a technical Photoshop term, blah. If a font doesn't show in the little top part, like let's say you've thrown in some type and you go to here and it just says regular, it doesn't support bold and italics. Don't use the fake ones. So here's Times New Roman, which has regular, italics, bold, and if you're feeling really enthusiastic, bold italics. This means that when they created this font, for every single glyph, they had to create 4 versions of it: regular, bold, italic, and bold italics. And there's some of them, like you get into like the Helveticas and stuff, for some reason not so much, maybe it's the Helvetica. Anyway, some of them you'll find like huge lists of like ludicrous amounts of stuff. Arial, not so much. Anyway, some of them, they go halfway down the screen there, which means they were really busy when they were making those fonts. Maybe you're doing like a headline and you want to have it all caps, but maybe you don't know if you want it all caps. Like if you just like the name of a product or like the name of your studio, all caps would probably be fine. But if it's like a slogan, should it be all caps? Should it be upper and lowercase? If you're not sure, you can, and sometimes you type it out. Now let's try it all caps. Oh no, let's type it out again. You can simply click this. This is okay to use. The faux bold and the faux italics, those are bad things, but this is okay to use. Click it, you get your all caps, you click it again, you're back to your upper and lower case. So maybe you click this and you're like, oh, it kind of looks like I'm yelling at someone. If you send like an email or a text and it's all caps, it feels like you're yelling at them, and you feel self-conscious about that. So you can just undo it. There's nothing permanent about it. Cool. Maybe you want that more elegant look of the all caps, but you don't want it to feel like you're yelling at somebody. You have the small caps over here. And if you click on that, wherever you had typed an uppercase character, a majuscule, it gives you the full uppercase character. But where you had typed a lowercase, it replaces it with the uppercase glyph, but at the height of a lowercase. So you get that classier look of the all uppercase, but without the, you're yelling at somebody kind of feel to it. So, any of these ones here are okay to use. Just that bold and the italics, bad things to use. So there's an example of the all caps. There's the small caps. Oh, here's a question. Anybody know why they call them uppercase and lowercase? Did anybody do typography in the late 1600s, 200-300 years ago? No? If you go to like a flea market, you'll often find typographers' cases, which people often hang them on the wall and put little knickknacks inside. In the days of movable type, the Gutenberg press and stuff, there were little blocks of metal with a letter on the top, and then you would line up all the blocks in a frame, and then you ink it, you'd put the paper over top, and you'd squish the press down to make your print. And you could make as many as you want, just re-ink it, put more paper on. The typographers' drawers were in cases, and in the upper case, they kept the majuscule, the big ones, and in the lower cases, they kept the minuscule. So uppercase and lowercase referred to where they were in the typographers' cases. So there you go. And we'll throw back to typographers a little bit more when we're talking about some of the other features in here. Superscript and subscript, maybe you're doing some mathematical formulas. Here's your superscript. It makes it small and kind of raises it up a little bit. This is MC2, this is MC squared, very different. If you're making water, you've got some hydrogen and oxygen, you want to mix it together properly, this is just H20, that doesn't mean anything. This is H2O. There you go, there's your subscript. Underscore. Photoshop isn't really meant for typography. So you can't control how far below, how thick the line is. Things like InDesign, Quark Express, those are meant for typography. You've got a lot more control. You can say how far you want that line to be, how thick do you want it to be. So usually if I have to underscore something, I just make a line using the line tool. You can set your own thickness based on the size of the line, and I'll move it until it looks comfortably underneath the letters there. Same deal with strike through. You can't control and I'm not even sure why you would use strike through in Photoshop anyway. The original idea for strike through, back in the days of typewriters, like actual hammers hitting paper and stuff, if you made a mistake and you didn't want to have to get the liquid paper out, or before the days of liquid paper, you would just use the hyphen and strike through it. And if you're doing like blogging or something, if you make a mistake, it's considered unethical to just correct your mistake and pretend it never happened. So some people will put a note at the end. Some people would just do a strike through the mistake and put the correction afterwards. I can't see why you would use it in Photoshop. And again, I would probably just make a line and stick it over top. I'd probably do it diagonal just for extra jauntiness. But those are the options there. There is one more thing that you might often use in here, this FI. And it relates to ligatures. You guys ever heard of ligatures? So, one person in a class a while ago said it's what you strangle people with. They've been watching the crime shows and stuff. And yes, a ligature is something you use to strangle somebody. But just like your ligaments, oh, good golly, I hadn't thought of that. Thank you. Fortunately, they've graduated now and they've moved on. Anyway, just like your ligaments hold your bones together, ligatures hold letters together. So in the case of like this Wi-Fi here, this is called the kerning here. And it actually relates to in the days of the movable type, the metal blocks, let's say you had like an A and a W side by side. Well, they're each on their own blocks, so if you had an A and W, they couldn't, they say the closest they could get was like, until the metal blocks are touching. Eventually, they came up with the technology to actually have a little bit of metal overhanging the block. So say for the W, the top of the W would actually hang off the metal block. So the A block would kind of slide in beside it, and you could actually have the letters kind of overlapping a little bit. So the kerning is the kind of spacing between letters, and it's decided by whoever creates the font. They kind of decide what the spacing is between. And you can see for like the Wi-Fi here, the spacing here is nice and even. The problem comes when stuff like this happens. The top of the F is bumping into the little circle there. So you could change the way the kerning is set. I could take it from metrics, which is whatever the font designer decided was appropriate, to optical, where the software will take a look, and if it looks like things are awkwardly spaced, it'll move it over. So it shifted the I over. You get a bit of a wider gap at the bottom, but at least you don't have this going on. And for a modern word like Wi-Fi, you'd probably just do that. Change the kerning from metrics to optical. Problem solved. Although, let's say there's a theater company that was coming in and they were doing like, The Marriage of Figaro, and they wanted that very classical look where, the letters join into each other with ligatures. Select what you got there, and the ligatures are found this little FI. And when you click it, hopefully, that's going to happen. So whoever created this font created a separate glyph for the F and I combination. So when the software says, okay, he's turned on ligatures, let me take a look. Oh, there's an F and an I ligature in there, a separate glyph for that. So it removes the F, removes the I, and it drops in the FI glyph. Unfortunately, sometimes when people create fonts, notice how this is dimmed out. This does not have contextual alternates. It does not have swash. It says that it has standard ligatures, and when you click it, oh by golly, it does. There are times where whoever creates the font doesn't disable this, and it looks like it supports it. So let's say that theater company is coming in, they're like, oh yes, we're doing The Marriage of Figaro, and we want to have that very classical looking where things are joined together. And you click this and nothing happens. Find a different font. And actually, you notice I changed this to Minion Variable Concept. I did the original one in Times New Roman, but Times New Roman does not support ligatures, so that kind of threw me off a little bit. So I changed this to one that did support ligatures. There it is. So make sure that that happens if you need ligatures. Okay, just clicking that doesn't mean it's going to do it. Paragraph type versus regular type. Most of the word processing programs, like page layout programs, like InDesign, things like that, you have to make a text box. You click and you drag. With Photoshop, you might have noticed that if you just click, and start typing, it will eventually run right off the, oh crap, page. You have to manually put in a hard return. A hard return is something that's actually in the line of type. So if I was typing, I'm like, oh, that ran right off the page. Maybe I'll put a return after run. I could select the space, I could hit return. That's a hard return. And I could put another one in here. That's a pain in the butt. Like, what if you were doing like a little, blurb about me, a bio section, and you're like, I wish it was a little bit narrower. If you put hard returns in at the end of every line, you're like, well, how do I make it narrower? If you click and drag when you're making your type, it'll create a paragraph box. And now, when you reach the end of the line, it, are you ready for this? Will magically wrap onto the next line. Which means if you change your mind about how wide you want that column to be, you can just grab this and it will automatically rewrap depending on the size of your box. So that's paragraph type. So regular type, like if you're just doing like, the name of your company, the logo, the product name, just a click, type it in, everything's good. But if you aren't sure how wide you want that column to be, click and a drag will give you paragraph type. And you may have noticed that it throws in this random gibberish in there. Have you guys seen that stuff before? It's called filler type, or some people just call it lorem ipsum. If you're doing a layout for something and you don't have the body copy yet, but you want to get some opinions from people, if you just put in like random gibberish, it's very kind of visually distracting. You're kind of looking at it going, eh. So you can't appreciate the design as a design. But if you put in words like a poem or something, people are, they tend to read that instead of just appreciating the layout. So the idea behind lorem ipsum is it goes in and it looks enough like a language that you're not tempted to read it, but it's not visually jarring. You might have noticed now if you make a text box or whatever, it automatically throws some lorem ipsum for you. This I actually put in before they had the automatic lorem ipsum. There's no paragraph breaks. It's just a big long line of text there. But if you look online, you can actually find lorem ipsum generators. And there's a whole bunch of them out there. The first one that pops up is lipsum.com. Gives a little bit of a history of the lorem ipsum, and you can tell it how many paragraphs you need or words or bytes or whatever. Click generate lorem ipsum and it will come up with something that looks more like natural type. If you want something that's a little bit hipper, you've got hipsum or hipster, ipsum.com with artisanal filler text for your next project. So you tell it again how many paragraphs you need, whether you just want pure hipster or a little bit of Latin. Hit beer me, and you can copy and paste that in. So it's lorem ipsum with, or if you're a big fan of Samuel L. Jackson movies, there's slipsum.com, which will generate random Samuel L. Jackson movie quotes. All options for you. Sometimes you can turn regular text into paragraph text, but for some reason, not all the time. So let's say I had put a type, I type, return, type, return, type, return. Sometimes when you've got this layer selected, you can, convert to paragraph, and it did it. There you go. So if you messed up, I need to make some paragraph type. Sometimes that will work. It'll take out the hard returns, and no, or will it? No, it doesn't, dagnabbit. So you would have to remove the hard returns by hand, which kind of sucks. But that's a way of taking regular text and turning it into paragraph, but the hard returns are still in there. Another thing about the paragraph, you'll notice that down the left side here, everything's all lined up. This is referred to as left justified. And the right side is ragged. You can see we have a ragged edge down there. At the top, you have three really basic justifications. There's center justified, there's right justified, where the right is justified, the left is ragged, here both sides are ragged. Maybe you're doing a movie poster and you know all the credits and stuff at the bottom are always center justified. If you want a few more options though, if you pop into your paragraph panel, there's the character panel, the paragraph panel gives you some more options. You got your basic left, center, right justification, but also both sides justified, with any remaining lines, in this case, justified to the left, or to the center, or to the right. And be careful of this last one. This is justify all. every line gets justified, including the last line, which in this case didn't work out so good because, well, we just have 3 little words at the end. It happens. What you can play around with is the tracking, which is the average space in between letters. So let's say I selected all of this, or even just select the layer that has the type on it. And right now, my tracking is -10. Let's see if I put it to 0. By going from -10 to 0, the average space between letters increased, and a few of these words actually got bumped down to the next line. What if I took it to +10? Ooh, even better. The spacing between these words is still a little bit larger. What if we tried +25? Oh, that clearly took a little bit too far. Wow, it even hyphenated the last word and just put rum on the bottom there. So that probably wasn't good. The distance between each line. Anybody know what that's called, the distance between each line? It's this line over here, and if you hover, the name will pop up. Set the, a lot of people call it leading. It's not, it's leading. Because again, back in the days of movable type, you'd put your bottom row of letters down into the frame, and if you wanted to increase the space in between lines, you would put down a thin strip of lead, and then you'd put down the next row. And the thicker the lead, the bigger the gap in between lines. So this is the leading, and by default, it's set to auto, which is whatever the font designer decided was an appropriate space between rows, but you can change that. I could make it 6 point if I wanted, and it would look terrible. I could make it 72 point, and it would be way too wide. And maybe you want a bit of a more open sort of feel. Like, you know, if you look at the title page of like a really old book, you'll often find that the letters are very kind of widely spaced. Or maybe you want to have a very chaotic, almost like a graphical sort of element. So you kind of scrunch everything up as kind of as something behind. You can play around with all of these different settings in here, the leading and the tracking. I'll throw that back to auto. And the tracking I'll put back to +10 because that seemed about the best. All right, what else do we need to know about? Oh, you can put type on a path. You'll notice there's a file in there called type on a path. So named because if you look in the paths panel, there's some paths in there. And let's say you had a bottle of champagne in an ice bucket and you want to have the type kind of follow along the curves of the side of the wine bottle. Normally, you'll notice that your type tool has this little dotted rectangle around it. But if you have a path selected in the paths panel, look what happens when I hover over the path. You'll see this little squiggly line. And wherever you want that line to start on the path, say I want it to start right at the very beginning here, if I click, boink. Oh, although it did start up with a very small. Okay, you'll notice that there's a little circle here and there's a little X at the beginning. I'm not sure why it came in so small, but if I hold down the Command key, this is the end of that line. And as I make it larger, whoops, and also you can pull it to either side. If I pull it to the bottom, it's on the bottom of the path. If I pull it to the top. But as I stretch this out, and I'm not sure why it came in so small, but anyway, I can stretch this a little bit further along the path there. Hold down the Command key, as long as you got that path panel selected, you can grab that little thing and you can, whoops, oh, you can also move the path as well. Let's get off the path there. There we go. We can stretch that across to get a larger gap. And if you want it on the upside versus the downside. And another cool thing, let's say it's a closed path, a circle, a rectangle, a square, or a stake shape, or an artist's palette. Normally, again, you get that dotted square around it. If I hover over the path itself, just like the bottom one, it'll let me type around the path. But if I go inside, you see a circular shape, and now it will fill the path with type. So whatever shape your path is, you can fill that with type. If I did the one where it goes around the outside of the circle there, we can change the path afterwards. If I take the pen tool, just P on the keyboard, I can select that path. I can move these little points around. Or, and this is kind of cool, if I don't have this path selected, like right now I've got this path selected, let's say I did a Command T, I would be changing the size of the path, and you'll notice that the type goes around the path, but now it's going around an oval. If I don't have this path selected, I just clicked off of the path, it's no longer highlighted, so now all I have is this type layer, and I do a Command T, watch this. The type itself looks like it's tilting away from us. So maybe I had a can of soup and I wanted to make it look like it was the best can of soup in the world. The type is orbiting around it like the rings of Saturn. I could throw a layer mask onto there, and I could remove some of this with some black paint so it kind of goes around behind the soup can, stuff like that. So it's surprisingly cool things you can do with type and paths.
It's cool. It's trippy.
Yeah, like it's orbiting around something. And you know, you could give it a bit of a rotation. There we go. You could have words orbiting around the Earth. You know, I wish we had rings or something like that. Guys, there's one more thing about type on a path that I want to show you. And let's say I had put some, I don't know, type on a path like that. As you bend the path around, like I said, the type is going to bend with it. And if you really bend it around, you really give it a good crank, you might notice that some of the letters start to bump into each other. When you're adjusting the tracking, you can do it on a letter by letter basis. Like over here, see the lorem? They're kind of, because it's fanning out this way, the gap in between seems too wide. So if I just take a single letter, grab my type tool, and say I take just the O, I can hover over this, remember it's a scrubby slider, and I can pull the R a little bit closer. Over here, where the S and the I are bumping into each other, if I select the S with that scrubby slider, I can push the I a little bit farther away. So if you find that you're doing curves and things that they're bumping into each other, you can push those letters around. Is there anything else we need to know about type? We did the clarity of fonts. Let me talk about warped text. There's various ways of warping the type. Let's say I had some text here, and again, scrubby slider, bigger text. At the top here, you'll see this T with a little bit of a bend underneath it. If I click on that, here's some various ways we can warp the text. I could do an arc. There it's bending downwards, there it's bending upwards. Maybe you're doing like a record and you want it to kind of wrap its way around the record. Oh, also, you'll notice that my preview is not doing well at all. I'm using a slightly older version of Photoshop. I'm on CC 2019 because I blew out my Photoshop 2020 yesterday. I was showing a class the crop tool and how if you don't delete cropped pixels and you try to crop a really tiny area, it'll try to scale that up and make like a multi gigabyte document. And my Photoshop crashed and I cannot get my Photoshop 2020 to launch. I'm gonna have to uninstall it and reinstall it. So there you go. Be really careful if you're trying to show people how ridiculously big of a file you can create. So I'm back to Photoshop 2019, and my previews are not coming up all that fast. But there you go. You can do horizontal distortion, vertical distortion. If you want to reset everything, and this works in a lot of dialogues, if you hold the Option key, the cancel button will often turn into a reset. So if you're trying a bunch of stuff and you're like, this is not working at all, levels, curves, stuff like that, hold the Option key, you can reset everything back to normal. If your client wanted it to look like a waving flag, there's your waving flag text. If your client wanted it to look like a fish, I've never had a client want type look like a fish, but there you go, you can make fish type. And when you hit OK, there's your warp type. Notice that the icon turns into that kind of T with a bend under it, just so you know that there's some kind of a warp going on the type there. How's everybody doing? So far, so good? Oh, wait, guys, there is one more thing I do want to show you. Sorry about that. Remember I said, if you're sending it to somewhere and they might not have that font, you have to send the font. There is a way you could get around that. Let's say I threw some type on here, text, awesome. If I select the type layer, under type, I can convert it to a shape, which means with the pen tool, let's say I hit P on the keyboard, I can actually grab these little points and move them around, which opens up some surprising possibilities. Let's say you were doing your logo and I was doing like, you know, a G and a D, and I was like, geez, I wish I could combine these things together. By converting it to a shape, you can actually delete points, add points, you could make, you know, whatever. And the best part is, this is now just a shape layer. So in that case, you wouldn't have to include the font because all the vector information is still in there. But probably the coolest part of this is being able to change your fonts, right? So just throwing that out there too.